All right, well, it is 4:30, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Forward in Energy Forum. We appreciate all of you joining here online today. My name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute here at UW-Madison. And if this is your first time joining us for one of our events, the Wisconsin Energy Institute's mission is to provide leadership on campus for multidisciplinary research, education, and outreach efforts with the goal of accelerating the world's transition to clean energy systems and solutions. And the Forward in Energy Forum is a monthly series that's part of our efforts here at WEI to cultivate public understanding of energy issues. This forum brings together experts both on and off campus with the goal of encouraging cross-disciplinary dialogue to explore the important technical, social, political, and economic dimensions of a wide variety of clean energy innovations and topics. And today's panel was inspired not only by Black History Month, but also by a new lesson plan for middle and high school students developed by our friends and partners at the K-12 Energy Education Program, or KEEP, Wisconsin KEEP program for short. We'll be posting a link to that lesson plan, which is similarly titled Black Leaders in Energy, in the chat if you're interested in that lesson plan. So thank you for KEEP for developing that and inspiring this panel today. And building off of that lesson plan, our goal really for today's forum is to highlight the stories of several Black leaders in clean energy and climate here in the Midwest, with the hope of inspiring others to get involved and continuing to push for greater representation of Black voices and leadership and decision-making roles in our clean energy transition. But before we get to today's session, I do want to first acknowledge that the land that the Wisconsin Energy Institute occupies, as well as all of UW-Madison, is the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk people, who have called this land Dejop since time immemorial. We recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and the 11 other First Nations that reside in the boundaries of the state of Wisconsin. And we also like to acknowledge that the tribal nations are doing some of the most important and leading work in transitioning towards clean and just energy systems. A few other announcements. I will also want to give a plug for our podcast series, Propelling Women in Power, which highlights the stories of women energy researchers here at the Wisconsin Energy Institute and the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center. Season 2 is just around the corner, but if you haven't caught our season 1 episodes, you can use the QR code or the link to use your favorite podcast service and hear some inspiring stories of women in science and engineering doing some great work in energy. Our next forum will be held Tuesday, March 28th at 4:30 p.m. Central Time. And the topic for this forum will be building a circular bioeconomy ecosystem in Wisconsin. And our goal is to discuss the opportunities to utilize our state's agricultural and natural resources to build a new bio-based economy that is sustainable, resilient, and circular. So please go to energy.wisc.edu/events to find more details about that program and all of our upcoming events. And finally, some logistical notes. We'll have some opening remarks from our panelists and some Q&A with our moderator before taking audience questions. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box. Because we have so many great panelists joining us today, we may only get to a few audience questions, but we'll do our best with the time that we have. And if you need live captioning, you can toggle that feature by using the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. If you do have any other technical concerns, please let us know in the chat. And now, to moderate today's panel and set the stage for today's discussion, I'm pleased to introduce Deneen Powell. Deneen is a Fuse Corps Executive Fellow on Climate and Equity at the City of Milwaukee's Environmental Collaboration Office. In her current role, she is engaging the public on the forthcoming Climate and Equity Plan from the City and County of Milwaukee. And prior to joining Fuse, Deneen was a National Director of the Path to Positive Communities. In this capacity, she provided training, capacity building, program support, and peer-to-peer learning opportunities for local and regional leaders to elevate the benefits that climate solutions bring people in their communities. And Deneen also served as Executive Director for Groundwork Milwaukee, which is an organization devoted to transforming the natural and built environment of low resource communities. So glad to have you here, Deneen, today to moderate today's session.
Thank you for having me. And welcome to all, and thank you for joining us. As we witness history's most transformative climate legislation and robust support for climate policies from both sides of the aisle, The clean energy movement in Wisconsin is poised for success, and today's conversation will feature 4 African-American clean energy leaders who exemplify the ingenuity and talent needed to succeed in our state's challenging clean energy future. We hope to share their stories and find inspiration in their work. Joining us this evening is the former Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, Sandra Henry, the Executive Director of Slipstream, J.P. Jones, Professor of Electrical and Renewable Energy at Indian Hill Community College. Victor Ujor is an Assistant Professor of Food Sciences in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. Unfortunately, State Representative Supreme Moore Umukunde could not be with us this evening. Let's get started. Each panelist will have 5 to 7 minutes to answer the following questions. How did you get involved in the clean energy movement? And what are your current projects or priorities? And let's start with my friend, Lieutenant Governor Barnes.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to have a chance to continue being a part of this conversation. Now, this is an issue that's been incredibly important to me for a really long time. One, for some personal reasons, also other reasons as it relates to my own personal story. Now, as we know, there are significant environmental factors that impact Black and Brown communities primarily, whether it's the I guess I should say the overshare that we have of air that is contaminated with coal burning power plants, causing disproportionate rates of respiratory illness. Myself, I grew up dealing with asthma as a complication, but there are so many other people. And I remember when I first started organizing, I worked with a group that took on our biggest utility provider because of the impact of coal burning power plants. The organization was a part of a coalition called the Cleaner Valley Coalition. And when I first took the job as an organizer with this group, I became more aware of what was actually happening. I was, well aware of environmental issues and hazards and concerns as they existed, but this is the first time I really had a chance to take a deep dive and really think about how it impacted myself and other people around me. And then other reasons, because I have often talked about my dad's job, working third shift on an assembly line, and his job being putting together catalytic converters. And the reason why we had catalytic converters in the first place, because the bold action that Congress took to address climate change gave my family a ticket to the middle class after the implementation of the Clean Air Act and the new requirements for vehicle emission standards. So with that being said, during my time as an organizer, it was the first opportunity for me to engage in this work in a more formal way. During my time as a state representative, had a chance to take on issues as they related to the environment and clean energy. But it was during my time as Lieutenant Governor, being appointed by Governor Tony Evers to serve as the chair of the task force on climate change. On that task force, I had a chance to meet a number of people who are here today. Had a chance to work and develop policy recommendations, some which are now in effect in the state of Wisconsin. One of the most exciting things we did was create the Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy. I see Maria Redmond is on the call as well. Very proud to know her, very proud of all her work on our state's clean power plan as well. And the focus of the climate change task force is to make sure that we not only did the work effectively, but we did it leading with equity in mind, understanding that the most impacted communities deserve a seat at the table, deserve to be a part of the conversation, also deserve to be a part of the process. And this hadn't always been the case. We were very intentional, we were very deliberate about bringing together a diverse and even bipartisan coalition of elected leaders, tribal leaders, industry professionals, community members to propose and critically examine the policy to move the state forward towards a carbon-free future. And the thing about the task force and the report that came out, please check it out if you haven't had a chance to, is the items all fell into one of three buckets. There were those that could be enacted through executive action, those that could be enacted through legislation, and those that could be enacted through agency rule change. Now, unfortunately, it's been a very slow road when it came to those that will be implemented through legislative change, but I'm proud of the work that the governor has done through executive action and some of the agencies that are already implementing rule changes to get us closer to where we need to be. Now, in doing the research on climate change and clean energy policy, it was about listening to those voices I mentioned before, but I like to think that the task force's work served as a roadmap for the state to move forward, and also, for me personally, gave me a deeper understanding and appreciation of what we can do if we all step forward, if we all show up in a real way. And we have more opportunities right now than ever before, especially with the infrastructure bill and now the Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the most significant pieces of legislation to help move this country towards that clean energy future with the incentives for homeowners. There's even for renters when it comes to lower utility burdens, which is something that's impacting lower income Black communities and Black and brown communities disproportionately. Now, when we couple the opportunities we have, this influx of resources and funding, we have a chance to see so much of that work from the task force all the way through. But we also have a chance to do it with equity in mind. And that's what I'm so excited about. So I'm so happy to be here on this panel with everybody else. Now, the proposals made from the task force, they continue to be my priority in my lieutenant governor afterlife, because we still need to transition to renewable energy, 100% renewable energy as soon as possible. And we have a unique opportunity like never before to create thousands of good paying jobs in the process, and also have the support of the federal government to make it happen, which is one of the things I'm also, which I just can't wait to see happen, and looking forward to continuing that work.
Thank you, Mandela. Okay, Sandra, you're up next.
Thanks, Janine, and thanks, everyone. Thanks for putting on this session. It's really quite an honor to be on this stage and share it with such wonderful, amazing people. So I believe the question was, how did I end up in this spot, in this space? Well, I'll try to keep it brief. It's been a 30-year journey. I started in the energy efficiency area, working for Midwestern utilities in designing and implementing energy efficiency programs. And in fact, I started as an intern at a utility in Minnesota, designing the first direct load control program that I'm aware of in the country. Before sustainability and energy efficiency was even a name, we called it conservation. That's how I got started. My background is I'm an engineer by training, mechanical engineer with a keen interest in controls and HVAC. And I kind of took that experience and built a body of work around energy efficiency in buildings over time. I had the pleasure of working with another utility to actually design and implement all of the residential and commercial programs for the utility that are currently in operation now. And made a transition into the nonprofit space to work on still buildings for DOE funded initiative. And I guess my mindset was, if we can get the energy efficiency piece right for buildings, the people that live and work in them will also receive the benefits. And I had the opportunity to work for the city of Chicago as their chief sustainability officer. And through that experience, I really began to see that not everybody will be living and working in those buildings unless we put policies in place to make sure that the benefits go to the folks that need it the most. And so my tenure as Chicago CSO was little less than a year. I served under Mayor Emanuel, but during that time I was able to put through a piece of key legislation requiring the city to go to 100% renewable by 2035, I think it is. And the current mayor and their sustainability office are building on that foundation. So that makes me very excited about that work. So fast forward to coming to join Slipstream. I've been in this seat for about 7 months now, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm having a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's also fun. And I'm excited to share that we are working on a 3-year strategic plan, which will center building decarbonization at scale with a focus on the intersection of climate and equity. And for folks that don't know Slipstream, we are about 147 folks. We are researchers, engineers, program implementers, policy analysts, service providers, and we have 4 pillars that we're really known for in the industry: education and training, research and innovation, program and service design and delivery, and finance. And I'm really excited to pull together a strategic plan that will knit all of those amazing pillars together to help us advance our mission, which is accelerating climate solutions for everyone.
Thank you, Sandra. JP, do you need the questions again?
No, I started this journey in the electrical industry some 35 odd years ago, still active in the electrical industry. My background is building power plants and became a systems integrator. That opened me up to being able to see building automation and many other things. So efficiency became kind of my default area of expertise in energy production, distributed generation. And I brought all that here about 15 years ago to the college, and I'm using that to train the next generation of folks.
And JP, what are your current projects or priorities?
Current projects are to get more students, primarily BIPOC students, but all students, into the energy career pathway. Some of my past projects is I was involved with the Iowa Energy Plan, as well as the Iowa Career Pathways on our workforce consortium. My current projects are to see if we can integrate more and more energy efficiency and distributed generation curriculum within the K through 12, and coupling that with partnerships with community colleges.
Thanks, JP. Victor, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Deneen, and thanks to Wisconsin Energy Institute for putting this together. Actually, I was born and raised in Nigeria, and I got my graduate studies in London, England. And I think that was where it started for me. When I was in grad school, I recall doing a paper on climate change, waste generation, population growth, and things like that. And the professor challenged us to think about how we could make an impact in our world. And he said, I'm an old man, you guys are younger. What are you going to do about the future? This is where we found ourselves. And actually, that really made me start thinking of how can I make a difference? What can I do with my education? What can I do with my training to actually be impactful going from here, and not just doing basic science? Can I find a means to apply that? So I had a very big dive as a result of that into looking into climate change and biofuels and pollution and what have you. And some of the things that actually struck me at that point was that we have about 6,000 different compounds we derive from crude oil. And most of the time we focus on fuels, just a few of them. We'll have 6,000 different compounds. And the ExxonMobil CEO was interviewed recently about their industry. And he said, even if we converted all vehicles in the world today to electric, we'll still need the oil output of 2013 because of the petrochemicals that we are so addicted to. And when I found out about that years ago, I started thinking about how can we solve this problem? What can I do to make a difference? And I grew up not far from an open air incinerator where waste was burned just like that. And then you smelt it all the time. And I figured we could do something about it. And there's a whole correlation between waste and biofuels, in the sense that the vast majority of the things we throw away as waste could, one way or another, either the technology still exists today, is being researched, could be there in the future. These things could be converted to materials that we use on an everyday basis, from clothing to cars to fibers and what have you. And that really inspired me to start thinking about what I could do to make a difference in the world. And that was when I decided to look at the next big thing I could contribute to, and that was biofuels. From biofuels, I've gone into biochemicals, being able to engineer microorganisms to use a wide variety of organic waste to convert them to chemicals that could be used to make varnish and body lotion and drugs and treating water and what have you. And that's what I've been doing ever since then. And it's one of the best things I've ever done.
Thanks, Victor, for your answer. And thank you all for your answers to these questions. It was a great segue, actually, because every single one of you touched on climate change. And so it's a great segue into our next set of questions, which is around climate change and environmental justice. So climate change really threatens everyone's physical and mental health, our air, water, food, and shelter. But some socially and economically disadvantaged groups face the most significant risks. And this may be because of their location, health, income, language barriers, and limited access to resources. Racial justice and environmental issues are deeply intertwined, as pollution, climate change, and lack of green space have disproportionately impacted African Americans. And as time passes, Black Americans will suffer the worst impacts of climate change in the US, unless we recognize that fighting climate change and justice are inextricably linked. For the panelists, how do you define environmental justice? And what is the #1 way that we can make a substantial difference in the lives of disadvantaged communities facing the climate crisis? And let's start with Sandra.
Well, thanks, Janine. So I'm gonna reflect on Hazel Johnson and her contributions. She is known as the mother of environmental justice, and I have a definition that is inspired by her work. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just read a sentence. Environmental justice refers to the cultural norms and values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to support sustainability, where all people can hold with confidence that their community and natural environment is safe and productive. And then the last sentence reads, a community of environmental justice is one in which both cultural and biological diversity are respected, and where there is equal access to institutions and ample resources to grow and prosper. And if you want to look up that specific definition, you can go to Green Action. So I feel like that's a pretty good definition, and it really resonates with me. And to answer your second question about what's the #1 way we can make a substantial difference, I feel very strongly that we must get the resources to the communities that need it, put it directly in their hands. I think there are a lot of probably folks on the call that may serve as fiscal agents, meaning that they receive funding from federal government or state energy offices, and then they redistribute that. And those fiscal agents are typically not diverse. And I would like to see us do a couple of things. Have more Black, Indigenous, Brown, people of color in that role as a fiscal agent. And also I'd like to see the funds that are available go directly to the hands of the communities that need it and can benefit the most, and kind of get out of the way. Because I feel like many communities already know what they need. They already have a vision for what a sustainable, resilient future looks like in their neighborhoods and communities. And I think it's our job to make sure that they have the resources they need to actually realize their vision in their neighborhoods.
Thank you, Sandra. JP? I think you're on mute.
Yep, I'm good.
Okay.
So I just look at it, since I'm kind of more of a technician, I'm not really a policy person. I look at it really that everyone's got the right to be protected from environmental pollution and to live within a clean environment, however that is defined, and it needs to be a healthy environment. So from a technical standpoint, for me, it's got a lot to do with processes, equipment, and how things get done. And typically, what I have seen in my lifespan is that the most polluted or least clean procedures and practices tend to happen around and in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods and communities. So I have to second what Sandra said about folks in those communities know what needs to get done sometimes, from a broad perspective, but I'm a firm believer that the more that we train the younger generation, the more that we train folks, they will start asking the questions and demanding the answers that count to help build that environmental justice for themselves.
And JP, what is the number one way that we can make a substantial difference in the lives of disadvantaged communities facing the climate crisis right now? Did you have just one, or was that it, the nothing about us without us kind of everybody at the table?
Everyone at the table, probably everyone in this panel, and some of those listening are probably the first and only in whatever environment they work in professionally in our industry of clean energy. But the fiscal agents, I think that is a huge part of it. It's not very diverse in the policymakers. It's not very diverse in the folks who do the technical side. I can tell that exactly from my own experience. And we have a different perspective, especially for the communities that are affected by that.
Thank you. Thank you, JP. And Victor.
For me, I think climate justice is just simply building, designing, growing, making policies with inclusivity in mind, just creating an environment in terms of how we build and produce and dispose of waste that makes sure that no one is left behind, as a matter of fact. If I go back to that, what I said earlier on, those who are more affected by climate change are those who are less privileged in society today, and predominantly colored people of color are more affected because they are likely to have a waste plant put closer to where they live. They're likely to have waste disposed around where they live without much done about it. So we ought to think very critically in ways that we design and build and grow and use and dispose of waste in a manner that ensures that everyone is taken care of fairly. In terms of what we can do now, there's so much I think we could do, but it's just so hard to think about one. But if you ask me, I would say we need to put funds in schools. The way we build things, the way we grow, the way society is evolving. I think there are certain things that won't be here in the next 20 years in terms of how we grow food and how we use it. If you think about the drought we've had in the West and things like that, we're beginning to rethink what we do and finding new ways and technologies to do things. And that means we have to train the next generation as well to do that. So I think there has to be significant increase in funding for schools in less privileged communities and Black communities and brown communities to ensure that kids are taught about what's happening, but most importantly, that they're equipped for what's to come that's already happening in some places. So we have to put funds in their hands. And most importantly, we also have to ensure that people from these communities are part of the decision making to disperse the funds, but also to train and equip the next generation so that they're not left behind in the skills evolution that's already happening and is going to even increase in the next few years.
Thanks, Victor.
You're welcome.
Lieutenant Governor, what does environmental justice mean to you?
It's everything that everybody has already said. So it's tough when you go last on this question. But I'll tell you, it's the inclusion of equity in the entire process of policy making. I heard what was mentioned earlier. When you talked about the policy that goes into place, it's the thought behind the policy, but it's also the outcome of the policy. It's making sure that there are more people even employed and hired in the clean energy space, doing the work, actually reaping the benefit from an environmental standpoint, a health standpoint, but also an economic standpoint, because in this day and age, with the trends in the economy, there is a lot of money to be made in clean energy. A lot of money is already being made in clean energy. A lot of jobs are being created. It's the fastest growing sector for several years. And with that being the case, when you look at who is unemployed, who is underemployed, who has stopped looking for work over the last several years, we need to make sure that people have adequate access to those opportunities as well. This means promoting the inclusion of all voices in discussions surrounding what the issues are, what the impacts are, how we can best evaluate the problem, and the best possible solutions, and also the eventual implementation. The work that we do is to improve the lives of those who are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. And that's why we need to listen to people who are sitting there right in the thick of it and engage those communities. That means from the beginning to the very end, and ensuring that we keep up the process of education for people, but in a way that that people understand, where it's not like we're trying to talk over people or talk at people, but actually having conversations with them.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. It looks to me like we've already answered the next question, which was around Black leadership and community voices moving in climate solutions moving forward. But I'd like to see if we can maybe take a little bit of a deeper dive into what those solutions may look like above and beyond the ones that we've mentioned at the top. Are there other solutions that could possibly be implemented now, things that we should be thinking about? And we've seen that in climate plans, not only at the state level, but at the municipal level and county levels. I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on climate solutions and what do they look like? And why don't we start with JP?
Well, for me, living and working in a wind state, I see, and an agricultural state, one of the big things is, for me, again, it comes back to training and outreach, is getting folks to make, climate changes that will affect the climate in a positive way, changes that will affect the environment in a positive way, become just the natural status quo. It's kind of like, I look at it kind of like safety on the job site. It only happens if you build a culture. You can do all the training in the world, but if you don't build a culture of being safe, it's not a matter if there's going to be some catastrophic issue, it's a matter of when. So right now in our plants, in our agricultural processes, these conversations are happening across the board of how can we do better. We don't always know how. We know we want to do better. We just don't always know how. And sometimes the reason why we're not getting to the how is because we're not inviting enough or the right people to the table to have the discussion.
Thank you. And Victor, any other ideas around climate solutions moving forward and maybe what those solutions look like?
I think one of the most important things for me is education, and that's not classroom education. And I think people need to become more aware. I recall having this discussion in the class, and it was one of those things where a group of students were thinking, this is not serious, it's not important. Another group thinks, this is serious, we need to do something about it. And I gave them a project to go look at how temperatures have increased over the last 25 years in a particular place. They all came back with the same answer, plus 2.5 degrees Celsius. And we all said, so is that an increase or is that a decrease? Of course, we agreed it's an increase. For me, that's the best education people can get. Not just talking about politics, not just talking about what I think or what I feel, but looking at the facts as opposed to all other things. So education to a point that we become more aware of what we are going through. Education in the sense that as a society, we realize that we're producing more manure than we can deal with today. We're producing more waste that we can deal with. And these things are going back in the environment one way or another, they're affecting us, not just because of how they affect water, which is really serious, but they have to degrade and put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that affects climate change. So there's that cycle going on. Education where people can fully understand this. And the second part of that is how can we as individuals begin to think of what can we do to make a difference? What I buy, where is it coming from? What I consume, what I throw away, should I really throw it away? How can I make a simple difference in our world? I think that's the most important thing I think we need to get people to start thinking about. Because if all of us pulled along the path of what simple things we can do on an everyday basis, we can change the market. Because we have the power to determine what's produced, how it's produced, where it's produced. If I don't buy it, you don't buy it. Other people will start thinking, well, this is not good for the environment. We're not going to go in this line. We can force the market to pull in a trend that's better for the environment. And that's a big part of what we need to do. We need to spend on technological advancement. And there are some technologies there now, but we don't have the finishing touches to get them to market. And these are the things that could change the way we build and grow and produce and dispose of things. I think there are many ways, but these are some of the ways I feel we need to really, really tackle this seriously.
Thank you, JP. I actually want to jump to another set of questions. We have a couple of questions that have popped up in the Q&A, and I think we can maybe do that for all four panelists. So one of the first questions is, what structural changes can predominantly white environmental organizations make to grow and support Black, Indigenous, and people of color in leadership roles? And let's start with Lieutenant Governor Barnes, please.
I think a big part of it is, showing up. Like so many times, like the spaces, look the same because people fail to branch out. Or what was mentioned earlier about the whole education piece, and not necessarily talking about classroom education. One of the biggest problems is that the way and where we have a lot of these conversations, right? Like I've been to a lot of different meetings about climate change and been to a lot of meetings about renewable energy, and they sort of happen in a lot of familiar spaces. And in order for us to grow, we got to break out of these familiar spaces. You got to be in places where you aren't used to being if you want to change the way things look or change the way we operate. Like some good examples, like the work that you've been doing, and also other organizations like even Urban Ecology Center, rooted right in communities, teaching children at very young ages. In order for us to be effective, like I'm from Milwaukee, but I worked on a whole lot of rural policy, and working on those rural issues, I couldn't do it just sitting in Milwaukee. It meant that I had to branch out. I had to go places and have conversations that I had never had in my life before, and I had to be open to criticism, and I also had to be, it requires a little bit of humbling yourself, realizing that you don't know everything as well. And if you go into those conversations, those spaces, ready to actually learn. And again, it goes back to an earlier point of not just talking at people, but having conversations with people. That's how you begin to make those spaces look a lot more inclusive.
Thank you. I agree. The best conversations we had around climate and equity took place in church basements and libraries and community centers in the heart of the city for Milwaukee. I want to ask the same question to Sandra. What structural changes can predominantly white environmental organizations make to grow and support BIPOC people in leadership roles?
Well, I would add cultural to that question. I think culture in predominantly white environmental organizations also has to change to be more inclusive and more equitable. I think that's a good start there. And as the culture changes, I think the structure will also change. I just want to echo Mandela's feedback about going to the places, like showing up at I mean, I think one of our favorite tools is to hold stakeholder engagement or roundtables where we invite the BIPOC organizations to come sit at the predominantly white tables. I would encourage the predominantly white organizations to show up at roundtables hosted by the BIPOC organizations and listen. I think that would be great. I feel like just by showing up, you are providing that support to Black leaders that are trying to grow their own organizations. And I feel like that's where the predominantly white organizations can be most effective. Is really passing the mic and amplifying the voices of the indigenous Black and brown organizations that typically have not been at the table. Let them speak, give them the podium or the stage and let them tell their stories.
Thanks, Sandra. I love that. So it's not just that you have a seat at the table, but somebody's actually handing you the mic so you have a voice as well. JP, any thoughts on the structural changes for predominantly white environmental organizations?
Yes, I'm kind of just re-emphasizing what was just said, but I'm a little different, I think, in my locale and my family's locale, and where I've served most of my work has been in the southeast region of Iowa, even though I traveled a lot. And now that I'm on a few boards, I will say that the most important part is that a predominantly white organization has got to understand that when they invite BIPOC people to the table, they're going to have a vastly different perspective and background than they are used to. So again, what Sandra said, their culture is going to have to change. We cannot just be invited to the table to say something and then whether passively or actively dismissed or not paid attention to. That is not going to work. And that is the reason why so many Black leaders who walk into those spaces sometimes don't last very long, because no one wants to be part of something that they can't be effective. And so that culture absolutely has to change. And then the same thing that I tell my school when we're trying to have these recruitments, just let's say into the program. If I'm going to use my old farmer way of speaking here, but if I want to catch bluegills, I don't go to a pond that only has catfish. And that's the way it works. And I find that many, many times what happens is there's not an encouragement of more Black leaders into these organizations. You tend to see the same ones across several organizations because they are willing to step up. But usually it's because that Black leader has learned to adapt to those organizations, and it's not the other way around. And so that meeting halfway has to become a part of the culture, in my opinion. If a white organization, especially in this space, wants to encourage and recruit and collaborate with BIPOC folks in the leadership roles.
Thank you, JP. And Victor.
I think everyone else has covered most of the things I would love to say, but I just want to add a little bit to it that the table, inviting BIPOC people to the table is one thing, but I think the table should be set in certain environments as well. Before I had a child, there were so many things I understood and I knew, even though I didn't have a child. Until I had a child and I realized I knew nothing. So you have to experience some things before you can actually effect change. So I think it's important to get in the community as well, to feel comfortable to get in these communities and say, how are you experiencing this? What is your biggest challenge? And I was writing a proposal once and I had a discussion with indigenous people about the impact of climate change in their communities, and my eyes opened beyond my wildest imagination, that they understood it much more than I could actually spell it out. So the table, it shouldn't be about inviting BIPOC people to the table. I think the table should be set in a setting that allows you as well as predominantly white environmental organizations to see and feel to an extent what they are feeling. And that will give you the power and the voice and the fire to want to actually advocate for them and also to invite and collaborate with them going forward.
Thank you. So we are now going to shift gears here. And we hope that by sharing your stories and your journey to where you are today, we might inspire BIPOC youth to consider working in climate solutions and clean energy as a possible career. So the question is, what has helped you reach where you are today? And what is one piece of practical advice you would give to others who would want to set off in a similar direction as yourself, or maybe they're just at the start of their careers and are not quite certain where to go with this sector? And let me see, it's gonna be, I think we'll start with Victor to give him the start.
All right. What has got me here? A whole lot of things, but again, it's hard to talk about all of them in a short space of time. I think is one thing you have to think about is having a goal that's bigger than yourself. Sometimes just getting an education is one thing, but getting an education with a view in mind that I do want to make a difference in my community. I want to make a difference in the world. It's something that inspires you beyond yourself, because you're going to get challenged along the line. I don't recall a student in one of my classes. It was a big class and there was only one Black student in that class, and he wanted to quit several times. And one day I had a chat with him and I said, why do you want to quit? He said, this is not for me. And I said, why? He said, this is a white problem. This is a white interest. And I don't know what climate change is all about. And I said, why do you say that? Is it that it's not affecting you, or it's not going to affect you? Or is it because you don't feel comfortable in this class, you're the only person? He said, yeah, I feel like I don't belong here. And I said, well, it starts with one. So if you can be resilient to have your voice heard here and make a difference, maybe we'll have two tomorrow. Maybe you can talk to the next person who will come back here tomorrow to do this program. So point is, being resilient and also keeping the big picture of what you want to achieve in mind has helped me a lot. And I also think about how what we are fighting against affects my whole community. What can I do in return? I remember my professor saying, this is not just an individual thing. Least privileged countries will suffer climate change more. Poorer nations will suffer climate change more. And I was born and raised in Nigeria, and I thought, wow, we're already suffering it. We're going to be in a real mess when this gets real worse. And that again was an inspiration for me to think of, what can I do to help stem the tide of this thing? So finding a goal much bigger than myself, and also thinking about my community. My principle is to say, if you don't know where you're going, remember where you come from. It helps you to recalibrate and think back again and know where you ought to go. So that's one thing I've kept in mind, the big picture of the problem, the big picture of what I want to achieve, and hopefully not for myself, to be able to make a difference that will impact other people. That can inspire you beyond my wildest imagination.
Thank you, Victor. Mandela, would you have an answer? What has helped you reach where you are today? And what's one piece of practical advice you would give others who want to set off in a similar direction, or maybe they're at the start of their career and they're just looking to break into this sector?
I'll tell you, you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Sometimes you're going to be in spaces that are tough, spaces that are challenging, spaces that are new, but nothing changes if you don't break the mold. So it's important to show up and always continue to learn, be open to learning more. And when you think you know it all, just realize it's something else that somebody knows that you don't yet, and always seek out that knowledge and that information. And it, like I said, it requires us getting out of our comfort zones. But look, this work is difficult, right? If you look at in the broader scope of it all, it is incredibly challenging, especially knowing what happens if we fail at this work, and knowing that this work requires, your expertise. Like, this is something you're passionate about. You have to step up and get involved and get engaged. I mean, there's no other way around this. Like, we have to solve this problem. We have to solve this crisis. And I'll tell you as well, it requires just a level of collaboration that, may seem unrealistic at times, but there are so many different ways to get involved. There are so many different ways to be engaged. And there are already so many people who are doing similar work. And it's always been my effort to make sure we aren't recreating the wheel, but we are putting a little more air in the tire. And when you are, trying to find an entry point, just, look for a space that you're missing. You know, if you look and you see a space that's like, oh, well, this space looks a little too white, or this space doesn't seem like, you know, a whole lot of people like me are there. That should be all the more reason you should run to that space and involve yourself.
Thank you. Sandra?
Yeah, I would echo everything that Victor and Lieutenant Governor shared, especially about like looking at where the gaps are in this continuum of climate and climate solutions. I'd say what's helped me reach where I am today is having a number of amazing mentors and bosses actually in my career that have given me opportunities to build a book of experience. And my mentors have been encouraging me over time to be curious, to be comfortable asking for help and guidance when you're not sure which direction to turn in. I think that's also important. And being comfortable with asking for help. I think that's a huge sign of growth and maturity, because it takes a bit of humility to really understand what it means to ask for help. A piece of practical advice I would give to someone starting is to find a mentor. And you don't have to look far. There may be someone sitting right next to you right now that is willing to be your mentor, and build a long-term relationship with them. You never know with a mentor, that's an ongoing relationship, and they will always be there to answer questions or help you along or make a really important connection. And I'd also say, be curious. There's a lot of opportunity and evolution in this space right now. I don't think we've figured out the end yet. So I would say be curious, ask questions, and look for those new opportunities where you can be helpful and jump in.
Thank you, Sandra. And JP, what are your thoughts?
Well, being part of the electrical industry, I would say that it's a little tougher when you're talking about tactical careers, I think, outside of the policy arena in STEM. You, as a BIPOC person starting out in this, you are going to have to become a master at learning. As much as I would like to say there will be a lot of mentors, that has not been my experience. So you will have to become a lifelong learner. And I will, as Mandela said, you will have to get good at being able to deal with being uncomfortable. But once you become a professional, things tend to turn. And so my practical advice is, you're going to have to look at, yes, you have a different background, a different perspective, but you have to find that middle ground that's going to allow you to project yourself forward. And your mentor may only be for 10 minutes. This one person showed you something. You may have no mentors for years, but at the end of the day, if you found that goal and you're curious about learning and you want to become a leader within your chosen field under environment and energy, your own self-determination will help that. So my practical advice is learn and learn and learn from anyone willing to give you some information.
Thanks, JP. And sometimes I think all it takes is that one conversation or one piece of practical advice that can start a student down a path towards becoming a clean energy or climate steward. We've now reached the Q&A part of our discussion, and to make this process move smoothly as possible, we ask the audience to write your questions in the Q&A box. If you would like a specific panelist to answer your question, please write the name of the panelist you're directing the question to and your one-sentence question or a few sentences to clarify your question if necessary. So we'll start now. What questions do you have? And I'm going to pull up the Q&A. There are two right now in the box. And I'll start with Kayla Smith asks, how could young Black people get involved with environmental justice policymaking as a career? I can't find many experiences for entry-level professionals. And I'm just going to make this a free-for-all, so whoever wants to answer can answer.
I would say it might be difficult to find a particular program that is climate justice alone, but you could start with environmental science, for instance. Most of the time, you need to amass or aggregate different experiences over time to be able to put yourself in a position to do exactly what you want. Now, one of the areas you could actually put your mind to at this point is environmental science as a career. And that has a component of climate justice. Almost every program I've seen in environmental science has that. So that will give you a start. And going forward, if you want to even do a master's or whatever in the future, then you can narrow yourself down solely to environmental justice. But you would have built a foundation that exposed you to environmental science and challenges and problems we have and solutions as well that are evolving. That way, you can now navigate through that and get yourself onto climate justice as a singular area to specialize in.
Thank you, Victor.
Can I add to Victor? Because you just reminded me, exactly right. I think your direction in education is great. And I would also say that look for fellowship opportunities. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the city of Chicago has a mayor's fellowship program that looks for young graduates. And it's a summer program where you get to work on a variety of experiences, including policy. And I'm sure that there are other types of programs like that in your respective areas, but I'll put that one in the chat just so you can have a reference for that.
Although I don't, as a profession, work in policy, I've been involved in many organizations that do because of my STEM background. I do believe that joining organizations, nonprofits that are in that will help you. I think that we talk about these tables, and sometimes you just got to crash the party so people can see your talent. For instance, joining your state environmental organization or your state energy efficiency organization. Many of those organizations will put you maybe not at the primary table, but at tables with folks who can invite you. I think volunteerism is something that you have to embrace in this sector. And it's kind of an indirect way to get to where you want to go. Most folks are not going to beat down the door and offer you a career path. You're going to have to probably carve it out for yourself and figure it out. When I first started in the electrical industry 30 some years ago, I would never have dreamed that now I sit on 2 boards of what I consider environmental organizations. And I wouldn't have dreamed that I would be so heavily working in workforce development. But it's important, and, I see it now. From hindsight is always 2020. If I'd have been involved at an earlier time in my career in those areas, I'd probably still be involved from that time forward. So I think that for young people, that's a good way. If you're trying to get into a career field, find the organizations on the nonprofit side of those industry sectors and get involved.
Thank you, JP. Mandela, do you have anything you want to add to this question?
Not in particular, just because it wasn't my explicit career path. It was the work that I had gotten involved in. But yeah, I think everybody else had a better answer than I could provide on this one.
I think the answers were great. And volunteering, understanding more about policy, sitting at the table and asking for internships and fellowships. Those are all ways that you start that environmental justice path for career path. So I have one last question, just for the sake of time, and I'll make it quick here. For areas of Wisconsin that have experienced severe job loss and poverty and are not engaged in these types of discussions, what is the best way to get resources and education to them if there's no one who's taking the lead?
I would say I think we should do a better job of using our libraries because, one, the resource and information is there. And, for people who have, trouble with, digital divide issues, that's just a great resource. And it also helps us to build community in the process. So being able to just be right there, again, it goes back to showing up where people are. Like, so a lot of this is us going back to traditional methods, the same way a lot of the conservation methods that we use these days are, just retreads of old ways that, indigenous communities used ages ago. And this is all a lot of, a lot of repeating itself, former old traditional methods that produce a better result than, new ways that we tried.
Thank you. I'm popcorning this one. So if anybody else wants to answer. Okay, so
I just want to add that sometimes there are opportunities that young people don't realize exist. I wish there was a way we could actually get them all to know about them. I recall once, I used to be in Ohio, and I was telling students about some fields related to sustainability that would be very valid for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And it's always going to be there. And it has to do with water quality management, water treatment, and all that. You have about 3% women working in the industry, and probably less Black people and indigenous people working in the industry. We talked about this a lot. I had students do papers on them, and they still felt they didn't belong to this environment. So I had to start a program where we visited wastewater treatment plants, water treatment plants, got them to think and talk to these people about their jobs. So it's not me preaching the sermon anymore. Sometimes somebody has to take the lead to be able to bring them closer to these opportunities and talk about how has this job influenced your life? What do you make? What do you contribute? And over time, I think I recently got an email from a student saying, I finally found you online. Thank you for inspiring me to do this. I'm working for this company now. Here's how much I'm making. I never knew I'd make this kind of money my whole life ever. It was because you encouraged me to do this. But the point is that it's not always getting a full degree. He did a 2-year program in water treatment, and that has set him on course in sustainability, and he's doing a job he loves so much. So there are different routes to it, to be able to contribute to communities that are struggling where there are no jobs. Sometimes it's not the traditional way, looking for simpler, easier ways that do not require the heavy load of scientific education that most people don't want to get or are afraid of. But you can still contribute through those means and also find out opportunities in terms of fields that are really growing in this space that will still be available in years to come.
thank you, Victor. We are getting close to done, but there was one other question that came in that has got a lot of thumbs up. So I just want to see if we can do a really quick round on this one. And I do think it's important because as we all work together in climate and energy, this piece is, I think, comes up a lot about how do we feel optimistic in this space. And so the question is, working in the energy justice and climate change space has a lot of ups, but it's easy to feel overburdened mentally at times. We have to really celebrate the victories. What are some things that make you feel optimistic about the future of this space? And maybe we could do it as just a really short answer, or just a couple of sentences, or a word if you have a word that works for you.
I feel like it's the energy. The energy feels really positive and excited. And the young folks that I've had the opportunity and honor to chat with and work with are really excited and energized by helping us figure out what the solutions look like.
Yeah, like you said, the students, the next generation, the fact that with people who are in high school, college now, this is the default conversation versus having to try to convince them that we need to do this.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited overall. Young and old are talking about this. It's not a subset of society talking about it. That's probably the most important thing. The other thing we can think about is years ago, we thought electric cars were impossible. They're happening. Most of us are driving them today. That's a big, big thing to celebrate. I can reel off a whole lot of things happening in the space in terms of technologies, bioethanol, biobutanol, lots of chemicals that were solely produced from crude oil, but we're making them today with renewable agricultural residues. And that's, for me, is only the beginning. So there's a lot to celebrate. And I think there's a lot of space, a lot happening in this space. Huge research, huge technology development, lots is going on. I do believe in the next 20 years that we would solve a decent amount of the problems we're facing in that space.
And for me, when we 15 years ago, when the program started that I teach, we started bringing we've always brought secondary students for visits, 8th grade day, middle school day. When they'd come to my lab in my area, they had very little knowledge of the equipment. And now when they come in, everyone, it seems like there's always every class. They know what a PV panel looks like and what it is. They know what a battery system is. They know, oh, that's a wind turbine. They know when I talk about energy efficiency, they can rattle back things they've done at home. That is a positive because we're talking about secondary students that understand these concepts. And that becomes part of their culture, which changes our culture in the future.
Thanks, JP. And I just want to add one to it because I've been working with the city of Milwaukee on the climate inequity plan. And I think that for me, I feel overwhelming optimism around the fact that our federal, our state, and our local governments have really stepped up to the plate, and they're taking climate change and environmental justice seriously. While we have a long way to go, if you think about where they were maybe 20 years on the subject, we've had great strides, and I'm very optimistic about what the future holds for our communities. Wow, it's hard to believe that we're at the end of our time, and our conversation just flew by so quickly. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your stories, insight, and wisdom. Your leadership is inspiring, and I'm sure that our discussion today has inspired our audience about climate action and clean energy. And thank you, audience, for joining us today. I would also like to thank the co-sponsors of this event, the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Wisconsin Energy Institute, and the K-12 Energy Education Program. Now let's check in with Scott to wrap up today's program.
Yeah, thanks, Deneen, for monitoring such a great panel. Thank you all to all the panelists. It's a really rich discussion. Something that I'll be looking back on the recording and just reminding myself of all the great responses. So if you do want to share the recording, we're going to post it to our YouTube page in the coming days. We did post a link in the chat, but we can maybe do so again. Otherwise, we'll probably send out a note to everyone who registered with a link to the video as well. So thank you all for joining us. Don't forget to join us for our next panel discussion in a month on March 28th. We're talking about building a circular bioeconomy. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.